Hello everyone again this week. I loved Mike's teaching asking us, how do we find our acceptance in God? Is it from a gospel originating from God or is it from man? I looked up the word origin and it said the beginning of anything, the birth, the fountain, the spring, the source. And I suppose if we're interested in the origin of a river, we'd follow the river right back to its source high up in the mountains. But we wouldn't go to any lakes or swamps of water nearby. John 3:31 was helpful to me in two ways in thinking about the differences. The one who comes from above is above all. The one who is from the earth belongs to the earth and speaks as one from the earth. The one who comes from heaven is above all. The one who comes from above from heaven is above all. We know that man's gospel, which is no gospel at all, is forever under God, who rules above all else. The source of our gospel is from God. Jesus, who came down from heaven to live among sinners and put on flesh. He was love and grace and humility and truth covered in flesh. Jesus was the blood offering that was brought down to the altar of the cross to atone for our sin. Jesus at the same time was our high priest who proceeded over the offering of himself as the perfect sacrifice. If we had attempted to enter God's presence as in the days of animal sacrifices in the Old Testament, God's holiness would have destroyed us in our sinfulness. But in his kindness he sent us a mediator of Jesus. Jesus laid himself down on the wood of the cross, which would crush and destroy him, to remove God's wrath from our lives once and for all. He made us who are enemies of God friends of Jesus, forgiven and set free of sin and death, and forever acceptable to God through him. God's gospel is above all. No other way is above God's way of making us righteous and acceptable to him. And the second point is the one who is from the earth belongs to the earth. The one who is from the earth speaks as one from the earth. Man's gospel is from the earth and belongs to the earth. Man's ways and teachings originate from sinful flesh. We used to belong to Satan and his kingdom. We're offspring of a fallen Adam. And so the type of gospel we believed and taught was all about ourselves, me, myself and I, taking centre stage. The motives for actions came from our desires to show our might and our strength. We reached up, we tried to break the glass ceiling, as I used to do for decades in my work, and we aimed for the stars and aimed even higher. As Mike said, we were like the proud people building the Tower of Babel up to God, making a name for themselves to try and show God how good man's performance was to climb up and reach him. They were pummeling their chests in their own fame. Look at me and my wonderful performance. I don't need a mediator, someone to help me up to God. I can get there directly. We were waving our own rags of our own righteousness, our merits, how good we were before God. What foolishness. I believed this myself for so many years. Man says, well, if it looks good, let's do that. If it feels good, then it must be right. If it comes from the authority of man, well, it must be accurate. But in reality, man lies in a pile of sin at the foot of the ladder, looking upwards in despair and guilt. The man who was not from the earth, Jesus, but originated from heaven, came down that ladder and saw our despair and wounds and struggles. The Good Samaritan who placed us on his back and walked one godly step after another up the road to Calvary. His way was not to bring fame to himself, but to serve the sinful ones on his back. He faced severe whipping, the bloodlust of the mob was crying, "Crucify him," the disgust of all human authorities, and the punishment of nails through his gentle hands and through his feet that had only walked the way of peace. He held us to his chest and he bled our sins away in an ocean of love, removing our heart of stone by his death and replacing it with a heart that was dead to self and alive to him by his resurrection, securing our justification. God is the origin of the gospel, as Paul said in Galatians 1:1, not from men, not through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him and us from the dead. Jesus is the fountainhead from which we now drink of his gospel accomplishments, by which we are saved in faith. Jesus was God's bread that came down from heaven to make us 100% acceptable to God, and now we live in peace with him.